Hello. Our story today comes from a 24-year-old, John McConnell, and he was one of the soldiers that liberated a concentration camp in Germany. Bombardier John McConnell stood with his unit, the 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment, watching as hundreds of unarmed German soldiers filed past the checkpoint in the small village just outside Kiel, Germany. Some marched, boots stamping, arms swinging defiantly, but most shuffled helplessly along. It was the 8th of May 1945, and for these defeated soldiers, the war was over. That morning, Germany had surrendered. Some of the Germans approached the watching British, hands above their heads, pleading to be allowed to surrender and be taken prisoner. All were refused and told, 9, go. John knew they were desperate to surrender. They were starving and hoped the Allies would feed them. Fat chance of that, thought John sourly. We've barely got enough to feed ourselves. There'd been no bread for 3 weeks. The celebration breakfast that morning for John and his comrades had consisted of tinned sardines, pilchard and powdered potatoes. There hadn't even been any beer for them to toast the fact that the war was finally over. Watching the Germans trudge past, John bore in mind what the army priest had told him about feeling sympathy for them. They are human beings, just like you. They did the same job, but for the other side. They are no different to you. Give them your compassion. But that was something John found very hard to do. The German soldiers were responsible for what the 63rd Regiment had discovered when they entered the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp just 3 weeks before, were nothing like him or anyone else he knew. It had been on the 12th of April that the German SS military officers had come out of Bergen-Belsen camp as the British 11th Armoured Division approached it. They were waving a white flag, and they told the British soldiers that they wanted to negotiate a truce and also surrender the camp. It was for displaced persons, they informed the soldiers. The problem was there was an outbreak of typhus in there. Because of this, the SS advised against entering the camp. They warned against letting the inmates out for fear they would spread typhus among the local civilian population. The SS also wanted safe passage for their own people. After some hours of talking, an agreement was reached in the early hours of the 13th of April. Most of the SS people would be allowed to leave, but the officer in charge would remain along with the regular German and Hungarian soldiers who would guard the outside. Heavy fighting in the area delayed the arrival of the rest of the British forces and their Canadian allies, and it was the afternoon of the 15th of April before the Allies were able to enter the camp. John and a unit from the 63rd were among those entering. What they found inside Belsen shocked John to the core. He thought he had already seen everything bad that this war could produce. The camp was a nightmare. 60,000 inmates in striped pyjamas, more skeleton than human, most of them dying of sickness and starvation. The stench of death was everywhere, from those who'd already died, their bodies rotting where they fell. John discovered that the majority were Jewish. Along with that, about 20,000 Soviet soldiers who'd been taken prisoner of war, but it took time to discover this, because the SS had destroyed most of the camp's files before they left. They finally got the information from the camp chief officer because he seemed eager to please the Allies who had arrived in the hope of him being granted his freedom. Those prisoners who could walk, desperate for food, and relieved that the camp had been liberated, tried to break into the stores in an effort to get food, but to the shock of John and the Allied soldiers were gunned down and killed by some of the German and Hungarian guards. The British shot the guards in their turn, and only then did the other guards hand in their weapons. Over the next few weeks, the British and Canadian troops worked hard to provide medical assistance and food, but even so, the inmates were dying at a rate of hundreds per day. So many dead bodies were piling up, increasing the risk of typhus spreading, that the British ordered the German guards and those few SS who remained to dig mass graves to bury the dead. At first the SS refused, but when rifles were pointed at them, they reluctantly complied. After 2 weeks, John and the 63rd were moved on to Kiel, leaving the 11th Armoured behind to continue the work at Belsen. But the images of what he had seen during his time there were burnt in John's memory. That was why, even though this was supposed to be a day of victory or of celebration, there was no such feeling of victory or joy in John's heart. War was not glorious.